So we start with Ian. Ian Duncan taught for several years at Yale University and the University of Oregon before coming to Berkeley in 2001. He is the author of 3 books, the latest one being Human Forms, the novel in the Age of Evolution, published last year, actually 2 years ago, 2019. My introduction is notoriously brief. If you go to lasertalks.com, you will find extended bios and a link to their websites. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. And Ian,
here I am.
The show is yours.
Okay.
I'll mute myself and I'll stop my video so you have maximum bandwidth. All yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Piero. Thank you for this invitation, and thanks everybody for attending this evening. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope this still works. Okay, my talk is titled The Novel After the Scientific Revolution, but it's really the novel and or in the scientific revolution. And specifically, I'll be addressing the so-called second scientific revolution, and particularly the revolutionary developments in the life sciences in the 19th century, of which Charles Darwin is the culminating figure. But I'm going to begin with a question. What is a dinosaur doing in the middle of Victorian London? In the opening paragraph of Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House. And I'll just read the relevant sentences. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. The megalosaurus was a recently classified prehistoric species. Its taxonomist was the great anatomist Richard Owen, whom Dickens knew. They were friends. They belonged to the same club in London. And it was Owen who was also responsible for coining the term dinosaur. This was the first feverish period in the early 19th century of the discovery and classification of dinosaur species in Great Britain. The year after Bleak House completed serialization, life-size concrete models of Megalosaurus and other prehistoric animals were put up in the grounds of the Crystal Palace when it was relocated to Sydenham Park in London. And if you visit London, you can go to Sydenham Park, and the Crystal Palace burned down several decades ago, but the concrete dinosaurs are still there. You can go and see them. Dickens was an adherent of the new evolutionist, or to use the contemporary term, transformist view of the natural order, which had been circulating in European scientific circles since the publication of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's work at the beginning of the 19th century. And this transformist account of nature was, of course, hotly controversial, indeed scandalous, and it holds that natural forms are not fixed, but give rise to one another in succession across the history of the earth. Dickens got his evolutionism from a popular scientific synthesis, a popular work of scientific synthesis by Robert Chambers, who published it anonymously, called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Published in 1844, immensely popular. It had gone into a 10th edition by the time that Bleak House is being serialized. It's a work of popular science that everybody in Great Britain read, from the Working Men's Mechanics Institutes up to the royal household. Victoria and Albert read it together. And its sales rivaled the sales of Dickens's novels. And I'm going to suggest at the close of this paper that Dickens indeed imagines the world of his mature novels in transformist terms. 19th century London and its hinterlands reflect a transformist view of the world, not a Darwinian one. That's something I'll be stressing. Because Bleak House, of course, came out several years before On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. Dickens's novel is alert to a revolution that was well underway in the modern life sciences, well before Darwin's decisive contribution. And in this talk today, I'm going to suggest quite briefly and sketchily some ways in which the modern novel, in the form that we've now come to recognize it, arises in complex interaction with the modern revolution in the natural sciences. Among the major forms of imaginative literature, the novel may be unique in having its origins in recorded history and in writing. And this is in contrast to the drama, epic, and lyric poetry, which all have their foundations in oral recitation and performance. The modern form of the novel solidifies in France and England in the wake of the so-called First Scientific Revolution by the early 18th century. It shares with Newtonian physics and the new natural philosophy a commitment to the empirical world, the world of common experience governed by natural laws. I want to look, however, at the novel's relation to the so-called Second Scientific Revolution, taking off in the late 18th century, central to which is the rise of a new science of life, culminating in the work of Charles Darwin in the 19th century. And this coincides with what one critic, Franco Moretti, has called the novelistic revolution of European Romanticism. And the central feature of this literary revolution is the reorganization of the novel around a key principle of developmental form, which emerges in the new sciences of life, primarily in France and Germany in the late 18th century. The German scientist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach postulates what he calls the Bildungstrieb, or formative force or formative drive, inherent in organic matter, which governs the development of the embryo from simple to more complex states. This principle of innate development is applied not only to individual organisms, human and non-human, but to the historical life of the human species by the philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder. What he called the Bildung der Humanität, the formation of humanity, signifies a moral and spiritual fullness of human development, which is the historical goal, the end, der Zweck, of biological species being. This conjunction of individual personal development and a universal species history is quickly taken up by the great writer Johann Wolfgang Goethe, whose novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship becomes the prototype of a new kind of novel, the Bildungsroman, the novel of formation or development, which narrates the intellectual and moral growth of a protagonist towards his realization of the full potential of human nature. So you have this double track of a personal growth and development, which recapitulates and realizes this larger magnitude development of the species. Bildung quickly gets systematized in Germany in the period as a program for the humanities or liberal education. And it's also a fundamental principle of the modern novel, in the sense that pretty much all novels of the 19th and indeed much of the 20th century are in some sense novels of development. Human nature is the crux where the revolution in the novel and the life sciences converge. The novel had established itself as a respectable cultural form in the mid-18th century by laying claim to human nature as its special theme, as well as its scientific basis. Henry Fielding opens Tom Jones with an influential statement to this effect. He aligns what he calls his new province of writing with the new science of man, represented by his contemporary, the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Universal, uniform human nature beneath the superficial variety of manners and costumes and appearances across history and geography. This is the principle that Fielding asserts following Hume. But then in the next generation, there takes place what one historian of science, Philip Sloane, has called the Buffonian Revolution. And it's the event that Darwin himself points to in The Origin of Species as the sort of the beginning of an evolutionist approach to the natural order, whereby natural forms are no longer stable and universal, but they mutate into one another over time. Buffon's book, his Natural History, decisively submitted nature to the forces of geography and history, cutting off metaphysical causes. Buffon himself drew back from the step of including human beings in this fully naturalized milieu, and in doing so, he underscored how necessary it had become, more urgent than ever now, that a metaphysical exception for human nature could no longer be appealed to, how necessary it had become to redefine the boundary separating humans from animal life. This was invested with a new urgency, and various properties or faculties were proposed: reason, language. The one that's most consequential for the development I'm talking about today is development. Humans, according to Buffon, and then to Rousseau in his Provocation in the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, Rousseau and Buffon argue that humans are the only creatures in which not only the individual, but the species has a history. All other animals, according to Rousseau and Buffon, develop in their lifetimes, but if you go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, they're still the same, supposedly. Whereas humans occupy a progressive history as a species, this movement towards perfection, so-called perfectibility. But this answer would quickly turn back into a problem once this developmental principle, which was proposed at first to separate humans from other animals, once it gets extended to the whole of nature. And the key figure who makes this extension is Lamarck, whom I mentioned earlier, for whom development becomes a principle that invests all forms, including the human. And we have the introduction of the scandalous hypothesis, the so-called orangutan hypothesis, whereby human beings too have mutated out of some prior animal form. If the Bildungsroman seeks to contain this potential problem by limiting its treatment to the career of an individual character, a protagonist, who arrives supposedly at maturity, and that's the end of the novel, another solution is proposed in another influential new kind of novel that arises around this period, an offshoot or close cousin to the Bildungsroman, and this is the historical novel established in its definitive form by Walter Scott. The historical novel extends the developmental principle across collective human life so that the transformative pressure of political regimes, social structures, cultural forms, all these come to bear on individual human destinies. But at the same time, at least in his early novels like Waverley, which is Scott's first novel, Scott reaffirms the principle of a universal human nature. And he does so by recalibrating the difference between individual and species life to a difference of scale. 60 years. Waverley is subtitled 60 Years Since. Its subject matter is the 1745 Jacobite rising in Scotland. 60 years as opposed to the canonical 6,000 years that were supposed to measure the length of human history, at least according to the history of the earth, actually, at least according to biblical accounts, soon to be overturned. National history then, history in this case of Scotland and Great Britain, occupies the intermediate or middle scale between individual experience, the growth of the individual, and the history, the long durational history of the race or species. And for this to work, the novel limits its setting to recent history, within which it's pretty easy to read off a kind of stable human nature underneath the superficial variations of manners, costumes, and so on. And also a familiar, a closed, limited geographical terrain. Scott's early novels concern themselves with the familiar geography of a small nation, Scotland. And from Scott, we come to what becomes the favorite setting in the English and French traditions for the realist novel. This is what George Eliot would call provincial life. Middlemarch is subtitled A Study of Provincial Life. The same term would be used by Balzac and Flaubert over in France. Jane Austen, Scott's contemporary, calls it the Midland Counties of London. She makes fun of the authors of Gothic novels for their fantastic unrealistic, supposedly, versions of human nature, angels or demons, set in exotic Italy or France, by claiming that here in England, or at least in the Midland counties of England, we can find a stable, recognizable, common human nature. This, I think, explains why provincial life, provincial England or France, becomes the kind of favored setting for realist fiction throughout the 19th century. But something else happens. The novel takes another direction, and this direction is taken decisively in the late 1820s and early 1830s, where there's a move in the late novels of Scott to greater historical distance. Ivanhoe is set 600 years ago rather than 60 years ago, and where that question of the stability of human difference becomes more problematic. Historical difference starts warping into something more fundamental, an anthropological difference. Perhaps if you go back far enough, those human beings back then are not quite the same as human beings now. And you have the turn of the novel also to urban settings, the metropolitan settings of the Paris of Victor Hugo and the London of Dickens. And I'll come back to Dickens in just a few minutes. Hugo's great novel, Notre Dame de Paris, gives us the city as an urban underworld in which species distinctions begin to disintegrate in this sort of nightmare, this hallucinatory nightmare, when one of the characters, Pierre Gringoire, wanders into the court of miracles, that the labyrinthine criminal underworld of Paris. It's as if before his eyes, the distinctions between species start melting, the distinctions between sexes and genders and ages all start melting and fusing, as if the city, the great city, has become a place where distinctive human identities and human nature can no longer remain stable. It becomes a kind of laboratory for the new sciences in the wake of Lamarck that are speculating on the transformation, the mutation of species. And particular, I think, to Hugo's art is the work of Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and his son Isidore, who are studying embryonic development and come up with a theory of species transformation, somewhat different from Lamarck's. Lamarck, you may remember, posits that species change through the ways in which an organism can change in its lifetime due to certain habitual actions, and these are inherited, they get passed on. Geoffroy and Isidore argue that it's the deformation of fetal development that can produce new biological forms. And Geoffroy carries out all these experiments on unhatched chicks, exposing them to different temperatures and light and so on. And the name for this is coined by Isidore, the son. He calls it teratology, la teratologie, which is literally from the Greek, a science of monstrosity. So the origin, the monster becomes the origin of the new species. The monstrous form, the deformed embryo that happens to thrive rather than just dying off, becomes the new species. And we can see this put to work in really interesting ways in Hugo's great novel, where Quasimodo, the hunchback bell ringer, is one of these sort of deformed potential new human species or varieties of humankind. And what's striking and disturbing about Hugo's novel is the way that monstrosity sort of spreads out across the entire novel. Everything and everybody becomes in one way or another monstrous, if not physically, morally. And I've just put up that passage, which I won't read, where Pierre Gringoire has this sort of intuition of a nightmarish meltdown of the distinctions of species. So this brings us to Dickens, who read Hugo, who was influenced by Hugo, whose London plays an equivalent role in the British imaginary, the place where the distinctions and consistencies that would seem to regulate the realist novel of provincial life no longer work. And both Dickens and Hugo, as literary criticism professionalized itself as an academic discipline in the 20th century, the realist novel became the sort of core form of the novel. F.R. Leavis talked about the great tradition of the English novel, from Jane Austen through George Eliot to Henry James. or Georg Lukács, the great Hungarian critic in studies of European realism, sees a tradition going from Scott through Balzac to Tolstoy. But Hugo and Dickens get demoted. They're seen as failing to conform to the standards of realism. And much of the criticism focuses on the representation of character. Dickens, it seems, and this was an accusation leveled at him in the first reviews of Bleak House and his other novels, is incapable of representing so-called realistic natural characters. Is it within the rightful domain of true art to make the unnatural character thus predominate over the natural, asks one critic. And these criticisms were legion. Dickens was addicted to an aesthetic of the grotesque. His characters were monstrous. And we can see this reflected in the styles of the illustrations of Dickens's novels when they were first published from the late 1830s onward through the 1860s. And here's Henry James, who began his career before he himself became a famous novelist at the end of the 19th century. He began as a reviewer, reviewing George Eliot and Dickens. And James leads the complaints, and he sort of concretizes in a useful way this criticism of Dickens for failing to represent a recognizable, plausible form of human nature. This is James writing about Dickens's last completed novel, Our Mutual Friend. Among the grotesque creatures, James writes, who occupy the pages before us, there is not one whom we can refer to as an existing type. The idea being that they all represent some monstrous, deformed new type. Like all Dickens's pathetic characters, this is Jenny Wren, one of the characters in Our Mutual Friend, is a little monster. The word humanity strikes us as strangely discordant in the midst of these pages, for let us boldly declare there is no humanity here. Humanity is nearer home than the Boffins and the Lamels and the Wilfers and the Veneerings, Dickens's characters. It is in what men have in common with each other and not in what they have in distinction. The people just named have nothing in common with each other, except the fact that they have nothing in common with mankind at large. So here we have James aiming this sort of naturalistic critique against the Dickensian aesthetic of representing character. And indeed, if you've read Bleak House or actually any of the great Dickens novels, you'll be struck by the way that the novel just proliferates dozens and dozens of bizarre, grotesque characters who seem scarcely human, who seem indeed monstrous, as Mr. Crook in Bleak House, the old rag and bone dealer, who seems on fire within like a salamander, and indeed he eventually burns up. He dies by spontaneous combustion, and Dickens was attacked by some of his critics for supposedly using an implausible scientific data. We have Mr. Vols, this vampire-like figure, one of the many sinister lawyers in the novel. The Reverend Mr. Chadband, who seems to have a great deal of train oil, which is whale oil in his system, who can barely stand upright. He seems to represent this regression of the sort of Lamarckian evolution of the monkey that stands upright and becomes human. The small weeds, characters so grotesque that even within the same family, Dickens writes, it's as if each member belongs to a different species. And what I want to suggest, I'm just about out of time, so I'm just going to leave you with these thoughts in closing, is that Dickens is absolutely serious, and as it were, scientific serious in what he's doing. It's not just that he somehow fails to master the art of realism or proceeds by a kind of capricious whimsy. Bleak House is a novel like the other great Dickens novels, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual Friend of his later years, that are imagining, they're conducting a kind of scientific imagination according to these Lamarckian or Geoffroyan transformist principles that Dickens has been reading about in the work of Chambers, to imagine what London, what modern society might really be like in this light. In Bleak House and the other novels, there is no more nature in the way that, say, the Romantic poets understand it. Nature has been overtaken and overwritten by human systems, human systems that have become self-perpetuating, totalizing, malignant. And they include systems like the law. That's not the only one, it's the primary one in Bleak House. But these human systems have begun to rewrite the code of humanity. They're rewriting their human origins. Humanity begins to be reshaped. It begins to re-speciate into these deformed creatures, distorted by the environmental pressures of what is now an artificial and inhuman second nature that humans themselves have created. And it's an enormously powerful vision, and one I think it's been perhaps difficult for us to read because we've all internalized the norms of literary realism as James and others have articulated them. But I think I leave that there with the invitation to revisit and rethink Dickens, and I'm just going to stop right here because I think I am now out of time.
Thank you, Ian. Very interesting. And anybody who is interested in this topic should read your book, because you will never read George Eliot the same after reading your comments. I have a couple of questions. So what do you see as the contribution to the understanding of humanity that came from these writers? I mean, this was a time, of course, it's harder to imagine what people were thinking, but this is the time when you have not only science, but you also have the Industrial Revolution. So you have machines. You have a totally different urban landscape. And also, I think anatomy was revealing more about the machine that is our body. So, I mean, overall, you put everything together, the theory of evolution and all these things, and it seems to reduce the value of human life. So, do you think these writers contributed something to understanding the human condition? And it's a problem we still have today.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the meaning of life, you know?
Right. Absolutely. And people, of course, went to novels for this, right? Perhaps even more than the other kind of writing. It's the novel, as the scientific discourses of life and of human life begin to specialize into separate professional subdisciplines in the 19th century, the novel fiction remains as a sort of common language that everybody can read, right? You don't need special technical knowledge to read a novel. And as George Eliot writes in her sort of polemical defense of what novels can do, novels, unlike, say, sociological treatises, she writes this in a review of a German sociological treatise called The Natural History of German Life. She argues that novels can activate our sympathies with our fellow humans, no matter how different they may seem from us in terms of social class or whatever. So then, if anything, that sort of humanizing or humanistic mission of the novel, on the one hand, really receives a boost, and novelists understand themselves as making an intervention. I think with Eliot, it's very self-consciously trying to shore up a sort of anthropocentric sense of the world where humanity still matters and still carries profound value in the light of developments in the sciences that are beginning to sort of dethrone humanity from the universe, right? Both Darwinian biology, which she's reading eagerly, she reads The Origin of Species as it's first published, but the other natural and other sciences too. So you have the novel becoming, or some novels rather, becoming one place where the human and its capacity to carry meaningful value is defended, particularly as religion begins to recede as something, again, that everybody has in common, both because Christianity is fracturing into different sects and confessions, but also you have the encroachment of Darwinian theory and other scientific methods upon the authority of religion. The other direction that I would take that this takes, and I think here Dickens is a good example, is novels that do something a bit different. They try and get us to imaginatively understand and envisage the ways in which perhaps we are becoming less than human under the pressures of modernity, of industrialization, the division of labor, even phenomena like urban pollution. There's been some very interesting recent critical discussion of Bleak House in particular that sees it as a novel that is intuiting what we now call, anthropogenic climate change. In a sense, the novel imagines through the famous metaphor of the fog, which is this human generated atmosphere that permeates all of London. It's beginning to imagine ways in which even natural systems, weather systems, are now being subdued to human intervention. So that's another direction. I think it's a different one from the way, say, that George Eliot in the English novel takes. That's really about trying to understand our own humanity and its precariousness.
And I'm curious if before the modern novel, so let's say the age of Rabelais, Cervantes,
Yeah.
Sidney, do you see precursors? Do you see that? I mean, did the novel had to wait for Lamarck and Darwin, or was there something similar going on before? I mean, can you see?
Yeah, I would want to resist a sort of teleological reading whereby somehow the truth arrives, Darwin, and the novel really comes into its own, right? And part of the work that I've been, I guess, suggesting in this talk, and I do in the book, is to call attention to the pre-Darwinian evolutionists who all rather got forgotten. Darwin's is the version that took natural selection or descent, modification by descent with natural selection, Darwin's phrase, eclipses the Lamarckian and Geoffroyan and other accounts. So on a sort of micro level, I'm trying to recover the interest and the value of these other scientific hypothetical systems and the way they get played out in literature. And I think, yeah, we need to do this for other periods. It's not that they were somehow wrong and less interesting. Rabelais and all the pre-modern things we might call novels, right, and literary forms are and often explicitly taking the human as their subject. There's the famous great chorus in Sophocles' Antigone, if we want to go way back, millennia back, where the chorus steps forward and calls upon the audience to wonder at the creature man and the marvels by which humanity has sort of mastered its environment. And of course, it's profoundly ironic in a play and in a Sophoclean tragedy in which humanity's designs and purposes are all overturned by the workings of fate. But they're questions that are there, right, at the very beginning of the literary tradition. They're just being played out and posed in different ways within different metaphysical and scientific parameters. Dante's Commedia is rigorously scientific in the terms of science as Dante understood it. I mean, Virgil, who's guiding Dante across the cosmos, keeps referring to Aristotle's physics, right? If he wants to figure out why the suffering of the damned will become more perfect, right, after the Last Judgment, because Aristotle says all things tend towards perfection. And Dante means his vision of the universe to be literally believed in, not just allegorically. Because physics and theology have not yet separated, right, for Dante. So I think that's a sort of framework for reading these earlier works we need to adopt, is to understand their own terms and how they're making interventions. They're thinking through these problems just as powerfully in just as complex ways as those works that may be in accord with what we recognize as a more up-to-date or more accurate science.
Wonderful. Well, this is just a teaser. I encourage the audience to read the book, or at least read the reviews of the book, and you'll see that the spectrum is quite impressive. There's one long chapter, I think chapter 5, that could have been a book by itself. So there's a lot of very interesting, really enlightening suggestions there, and I'm sure that some of the experts do not agree with everything you say, but it's still stimulating.
Absolutely.
Still stimulating. Okay, thank you very much.